What's going on, guys? In this video we're going to build a real-time chat application from scratch called Chatcord, and we're going to be using Node.js, Express, and Websockets using socket.io. So I just want to give you a quick demo of the application before we start. So we have this landing page or this join page where we can enter a username and we can choose a room to join. So I have just programming languages, but obviously you could use whatever you want. You could also just have a blank text field and have the user put the room name in. But we'll go ahead and click join, and now you can see we get the chat interface, the room name, which is JavaScript, the users in the room, which is just me at this point, and we have the message area. So I can send in a message here. We'll just say hello, and that will display here. Now I'm going to just copy this localhost 3000 and go to a new tab, and this is going to be looked at as a new connection or a new client. So let's call this user John and join JavaScript, and notice that Brad is already in the chat. And if I go back to the tab, the first tab, you'll see we get this John has entered the chat. So whenever a user enters or leaves, we'll see that message here. Okay, and if I send something like, let's just say hello John, and send, and I go to John's tab, we'll see that right away. So WebSockets is a protocol that allows us to basically have bidirectional communication. You can kind of think of it as an open door between your client and your server. So it's, we don't have to do refreshes or anything like that like traditional HTTP requests. So it's really cool. What else? So if we leave the room here and go back to this tab, you'll see John has left the chat. And if I join a different room, like let's say Python, and I go ahead and type something in here, that's not going to show up over here because this is the JavaScript room. So this is the app that we'll be building, and we have scroll functionality. So if I, put something else in here, you'll see we have the scroll bar and it auto scrolls down. So as soon as I type something in, it brings me right down as well. All right, so that's what we'll be building. Now I have the HTML and CSS all done. So if I go into VS Code, you'll see I have a folder called public that has two HTML files, index.html, which is the landing page or the join page, and chat.html, which is the chat interface. And right now everything's hard-coded. You can see I just have hard-coded users and hard-coded messages, but obviously we're going to use JavaScript to insert whatever we need to into the DOM, and we're using vanilla JavaScript on the front end. We're not using React or anything like that. And then I just have my CSS file and a front end main.js file that's completely empty. Now to get to the point that I'm at, just create a folder called public, and in the description you'll see a link to the GitHub, and there's a folder called HTML CSS which just has basically the static template. So you can go ahead and just copy this stuff and put it into a folder called public, and then you should be ready to go. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Now we want to, of course, open up a terminal, and you need to have Node.js installed because we're using Node in Express and Npm, which is the Node package manager. And we're going to go ahead and use Npm to initialize a package.json file by doing npm init. And this, of course, is in the root, not in the public directory. So let's just go through this. Package name, version, description. We'll say real-time chat app with rooms. And entry point, I'm going to use server.js. And author, of course, you can use your own name. And then license, I'll do MIT. So that creates a package.json, which is just basically a manifest with some information, any dependencies that we install, and so on. So I'm going to go ahead and install what we need for this project. So npm install Express, which is our web framework. We need socket.io, which is a framework for dealing with WebSockets, and also Moment, which is Moment.js, and it's used to format dates and times. So those are the only dependencies that we need in terms of regular dependencies. I do want to install NodeMon as a dev dependency. So let's say npm install -uppercase D for dev dependency, and then NodeMon, just so we don't have to keep restarting the server every time we make a change. It'll constantly watch it. All right, and then we just want to create a couple scripts, so we don't need this test script, so we'll create a start, and all this is going to do is call node and then the file name, the main file, which is server.js, or just server, and then we'll have a dev script that will call nodemon and then the file name, which is server. All right, so that's all we have to do in the package.json, so we can go ahead and close that up. So let's create our server.js. Okay, so this is basically, this is our back end, this is the entry point to everything. And we're going to bring in Express. Basically, I'm just going to create a very simple, just regular Express server first, and then we'll move on to implementing socket.io. So let's bring in Express, and let's initialize a variable called app and set that to Express. And then on that app variable, on this object, we can call listen to run a server, and this takes in a port number. So let's create a variable called port, and I'm going to use 3000, but I'm going to also say or process.env.port. So it's going to look to see if we have an environment variable named port and use that. If not, then use 3000. And we just plug that in here, and then we can optionally have an arrow function, and we'll just do a console log here with backticks and say server running on port, and then use our variable syntax to put in that port number. So just this, excuse me, just this should actually run by doing npm run dev, because we created that dev script, and we get server running on 3000. Now, I want to have this public folder set as our static folder so that we can access these HTML files and access our front end. So the way that we're going to do that is by setting here, let's say set static folder, and with Express we just do app.use express.static and then the name of the folder that we want. And I'm just going to use the help of the path module, which is a Node.js core module. So I'm going to bring that in. So we're going to require path, and then inside here we can simply say path.join, and we want to join the current directory, so dir underscore or double underscore dir name, and then the public folder. And that sets it as our static folder. So now if we go to a browser and we open up HTTP localhost 3000, we should see the index.html page. And if we put in a username here and join, it'll just bring us right to chat.html, because that's being used as an action. So in our index, you can see the form here has an action of chat.html, so it directly submits to it. There's no front-end JavaScript or anything. It just submits. And since we have, an input here and a select, that's going to automatically get put up here in the query string. And we're going to grab onto these later on and implement them into our application. Okay, so right now we just have a bunch of static stuff here. These are all just hard-coded with HTML. So the next thing I want to do is set up our server to handle socket.io. So we're going to go up here and first of all bring in the HTTP module or package or whatever you want to call it. And this actually is used by Express under the hood. So there's a method called create server that Express actually uses, but we want to access it directly because we need to in order to use socket.io. So what we'll do is create a server variable and set this to HTTP, and then we want the create server method, and we can actually pass in our Express app. And then instead of doing down here, app.listen, we're going to do server.listen. And it should still work. We'll just stop the server with Control-C and run it again, and you can see it still runs. All right, now to use socket.io, we have to first bring it in. So we're going to call this socket.io, set this to require socket.io, and we want to initialize a variable called io and set that to socket.io, and then just simply pass in our server. Okay, and that way we can now, let's actually go under this. And now we can say run when a client connects. So we can take that IO variable or IO object and say .on, which is going to listen for some kind of event, and we're going to listen for our connection. And then this will take in an arrow function with socket as a parameter. Okay, and I'm just going to, for now, just say console log, and let's say new WebSocket connection. So we'll save that. Now, whenever a client connects, it should go ahead and console log this. So we don't have anything set up on our front end to be able to do that. So let's jump into chat HTML. And now that we have socket.io set up on our server, we can use the front end library here. So in our chat HTML, we're going to add another script tag with a source. And we should be able to access slash socket.io slash socket.io.js. Okay, so that'll give us access to the front end library, and in this main JS we can access the IO method and everything we need to. Okay, so we'll go ahead and just close that up for now, and let's go into our front end JavaScript, which is public JS main.js. Now in here, I'm going to create a variable called socket and just set that to IO, which we have access to because of that script tag we just added. Now just having this, if I go back to our front end here and I reload the chat HTML, reload it a couple times, down here in the server console, you'll see this new WS connection. And that's because of this right here. It's actually connecting and we're just logging. Now this doesn't do us much good. What we want to do is send or emit messages, or I should say events, back and forth. That's really how this works. It's an open bidirectional communication. Think of it as an open door between the client and the server, and we can emit events back and forth. So I want to be able to emit a message to our client from our server. So in our server.js, make sure we're in the connection here. We're going to emit, so socket.emit, and we'll call this message. You can emit whatever you want, call it whatever you want, and then also send whatever data you want. In this case, I'm just going to send a string that says welcome to chatcord. Okay, now I'm going to save this, and the way that we basically catch this on the client side is in our main.js. We can now take that socket variable and say socket.on, just like we did on the server, and say on message. So whenever we get this message event and we get a function here with a message parameter, because on our server side we sent this right here, which is going to be this message. In fact, I'll console log this message, and if I save that, we go back and then I open up my client side console and reload, we get welcome to chatcord. Okay, because that fires off right away. As soon as we're connected, it logs here on the server, and then it emits the message, which we then catch here and then log. Now, we're going to be sending a lot of different types of messages. We have our welcome, so we emitted this welcome message. We're going to send, of course, when we type in a message. Also, when someone connects and disconnects, I want to have a message. So I'm going to go right here, and let's say broadcast when a user connects. So for this, we're actually going to do socket, and instead of just .emit, we're going to say broadcast.emit. Now the difference between socket.emit and broadcast emit, this will actually emit to everybody except the user that's connecting. We don't need to notify the user that's connecting that they're connecting. This will emit to just the single user or the single client that's connecting. And then if you want to broadcast to everybody, like you would when we send a message, you would do io.emit. Okay, so there's basically three ways to do it. This is to the client, the single client. This is to all of the clients except the client that's connecting. This is to all the clients in general. All right, so we want to broadcast when a user connects. So this is going to be message, and the message is going to be a user has joined the chat, and later on we'll have actual usernames. Now at the same time, when there's a disconnect, so down here, let's say this runs when client disconnects, and then we just want to say socket.on disconnect. I know it's a little weird that like this is inside of the connection, but it has to be. You don't want to have this outside of it. So on disconnect, then we're going to have a function. I'm just going to use an arrow function, and I want to then emit to everyone that the user has left the chat. So we're going to do io.emit, meaning let everyone know, and we want to emit message, and we'll say a user has left the chat. All right, so this here, let's just say welcome current user, and we don't actually need this console log anymore. Okay, so with all of these, we're emitting message, which we're catching here, so it should log all this stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and reload here, and I'm going to take localhost 3000 and go to a new tab, and this really doesn't matter. This is just going to bring us to chat.html. So we'll go ahead and join, and then over here in the console you'll see a user has joined the chat. If I either leave room, which will just bring me back to the form, you know, the join, or close the tab, you'll see now a user has left the chat. So those broadcasts are working correctly. Now the next thing I want to do is implement this messaging. So if we type something in here and send, we want to then emit that to the server and then have it sent back so we can put it into the DOM. So let's go to our main.js, and we need to somehow access that form. So let's create a variable called chat form and bring in that DOM element. So document.getElement by ID, and that form has an ID of chat form. So if we look at chat HTML, where is it? Right here, form ID chat form. So we want to basically create an event listener for the submission of that form. So we'll say message submit, and we'll take chat form and add an event listener. We want to listen for a submit, and then that's going to take in a function. I'm going to use an arrow function, and we want to pass in the event parameter here, because when you submit a form, it automatically just submits to a file, and we want to stop that from happening. So we can use e.prevent default, which will prevent the default behavior. And then we need to get the text input, and we could do that a few ways. We could grab it from the DOM, but I think a neater way to do it is to, let's just call this message. We can take e.target, okay, so that'll give us the current element, and we have access to elements, and then we want MSG. So basically we're getting it by its ID, which if we look at chat HTML has this ID of MSG. So we're getting that, but we do want the value, so we have to do .value. And then what we'll do is console log MSG. So now when we submit the form, it should get the message from the text input and then just log it on the client side. We're not yet dealing with, you know, emitting it to the server or anything, but let's just try that out. So reload, type something in, send, and it logs. Now instead of console logging, we don't want to do that. We want to socket.emit. Okay, so we're going to emit, and we're going to give this a name of chat message, and we're going to send that message as the payload. Okay, so I'll put a comment here. So we're emit emitting a message to the server. Let's see here, we'll just say get message text. All right, so now on the server side, let's go to server.js, and we emitted chat message. So now we basically have to catch that. So within this connection here, let's say listen for chat message. And the way we do that is with socket.on. So on chat message, then we're going to have a function, an arrow function, with message as a parameter that we can have access to, and I'll console log that on the server side. So now when I send a message, it should log down here on the server, right? So let's reload this and just type something in and send, and if we look down in VS Code in the terminal, it's logging on the server. Now what we want to do is emit this back to the client, right? So we want it to emit to everybody, so we use io.emit, and we want to emit as message, just like everything else that we've done, and send the message. So now it should log, it should call this because it's on message. It'll get it as the argument, and then we're console logging it. All right, so let's reload, type something in, send, and it logs here. Now, obviously, we don't want to just log this. I mean, that's stupid. We want to output it here, right? So we're going to have to do a little bit of DOM manipulation. Now, you could use some kind of template engine like Handlebars or Mustache. You could also use a front-end framework like React or something. But we're doing this all vanilla JavaScript. So what we'll do is we'll have a function called output message, and we'll pass in the message. So obviously we have to, let's put a comment here. So this is message from server. And then down here, let's create, let's say output message to DOM. So function output message, which takes in a message. Now we have to do a little bit of DOM manipulation here. So I'm going to create a div, and we'll set this to document.createElement, which does just that. We're going to create a div. We want to add a class to it, because if we look at the format of the messages, so we have a wrapper, or is it, of chat messages, and then each message has a div with the class of message. And then inside that we have two paragraphs for the meta and the text. So we want to add this message class. So let's do that. Let's take the div and say class list, which will give us all the classes, but we want to add on to that the class of message. And then we want to take that div, and we want to set the inner HTML equal to some backticks. And if we look in the HTML, again, the two paragraphs, we can just copy this, paste that in there. Now, we don't have access to a name or time or anything, but remember, we do have the message, so we can replace that with message. And then the last thing we need to do, since we already have everything created, is put it into the DOM. So we'll say document.getElementById, and let's grab the, or actually, we don't have an ID, do we? Basically we want to take this chat messages right here, which is a class. So let's actually use query selector, and we want to select the class of chat messages, which is the container, and then we want to append child and append the div. Okay, so whenever we create a message, it should add a new div to this chat messages. So let's try this out. It should work. So I'll reload, and we get welcome to chat cord, because that's sent from the server right away when we join, right? So up here, we catch it, we're logging it, and then we're setting it to this output message, which then puts it into the DOM. Now at the same time, when a user joins or leaves or we send a message, it all gets emitted as message. So all of these are getting caught right here, right? And it's going to output, it's going to run this. So if I put something in here like hello and send, there we go. Now it's always going to say Brad, this and the time. This is hard coded right now, but we're going to fix that in a little bit. If I open up a new tab and join, we should see a user joined. Okay, so if I go over here, we see a user has joined the chat. If I leave, a user has left. Now at the moment, it doesn't matter which room I join. Even if I join PHP, it's still going to say, you know, a user has joined. But we'll fix that in a little bit. Now, one thing I want to do, or a couple small things I want to do, is when we add a message, see how it does get added, but it doesn't automatically bring us down so we can see it. I want to add that, which is simple. It's just one line of code. I also want to clear this and focus onto it after submission. So that's really easy. We're just going to go to our front-end JavaScript, our main.js, and let's see, where do we want to do this? For the scroll, let's go right into it. Every time we get a message, we want to scroll down. So I'm actually going to bring in from the DOM the chat messages div. Set that to document dot, and what is it, a class? Yeah, so we'll do query selector class chat messages, and then down here, to do this, we can simply take the chat messages and set the scroll top property to whatever the chat messages scroll height is. And that should automatically do that scroll thing. So let's check it out. So if I reload and let's send, so now you can see I'm always at the bottom. Even if I go up here, if I send, it brings me right down to the bottom. Now another thing I want to do, like I said, I want to clear out the input. So after we emit chat message to the server, let's go ahead and clear in our input. So we'll take e.target.elements.message and set the value to nothing. And then we'll also just focus on it by calling the focus method. So now, if I reload here and I say hello and I send, it goes away and it focuses on the empty input, which is what I want. All right, so all that's working great. So now let's move on to, let's see, what do we want to move on to? I think we're ready to start doing like users in rooms, because right now we have just the message stuff set up. Actually, you know what? Let's format the message, because right now it's just a string. It's always just a single string. I want it to be an object with a time. Ultimately, we want the user and stuff like that. So let's go to server.js, and everywhere where we send a string here, I want to wrap it in a format message function. So I'm going to create in the root here a folder called utils, and in utils we're going to create, let's call this message or messages.js. And in this messages.js, I'm just going to create a function called format message. Format message is a function, and it's going to take in two things, a username and the text message. And from that, we want to return an object with the username. So this, just like doing this with ES6, we can just put in just the username. Text, same thing. And then I also want to add the time, which I'm going to get from that moment.js library that we installed. So let's say const moment equals require moment, And this is really easy to work with. If we want today's or right now, like this date and time right now, we can just use moment.format, although that's not going to look too good, so we can actually put some stuff in here. All I want is the time. So hour, colon, minutes, and then AM or PM. And that's it. We just need to export this. So module.exports equals format message. And then we can bring that into our server.js and use it. So up here, let's say const format message equals require. We want to go to utils/messages. Now everywhere that we send a message, we actually want to, instead of just sending a string, we want to send format message with a username. Now this stuff here, like the welcome, let's just make sure we add our ending parenthesis. Everything that is like a welcome or user join the chat, that's going to be from the chatcord bot or whatever you want to call it. You could call it admin or whatever. And since I'm going to use this in so many places, I'm going to actually create a variable called bot name. And we'll put that right up here. Const bot name equals chatcord bot. So we're passing in the username and the message. Again, we're calling this function username and, well, I should say text. The whole thing is the message. That's just the text. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Now I'm going to just copy this, and we want to do the same thing here. So let's see, bot name, and then add the closing parentheses. And then we don't want to, let's see, let's do this disconnect. Okay, so bot name, close that. And then this here, where we're actually taking the message from a user, we're not going to be using bot name. So what I'll do is for now, let's wrap that. For now, let's just say user. That's going to be replaced later on. So if we save this, let's go back and reload. Now notice what we're getting back from the server now, an object with username, which is chatcord bot in this case, text, and time. Okay, now in here we're now seeing just an object because this is no longer just a string, it's an object. So these two we can ignore. In fact, we can get rid of those if we go to our template right here. Just get rid of these two hard-coded messages so that it's just an empty div, an empty chat messages div. That way we don't have to deal with those two phony messages. So in order for this to show the text, we need to go to our main.js and go down to the output message. And this is now an object, right? It's no longer a string. So we want the text property from that. Also, we can get the time now. So we can set this to message dot time. Okay, the user, actually, no, we have the user. That's right. So we'll set this to message dot user. Is it user name? Let's see. Yeah, username. All right, so let's save that and go back and reload. And there we go. So chatcord bot 3:33 p.m., which is the correct time, and the message text. And if I say hello, of course, right now it just says user because we don't have that functionality yet. But if I go to, a different, let's go here, room doesn't matter yet, but if I go back over, we'll see from the chatcord bot, a user has joined the chat. All right, awesome. So now we want to start to implement users and rooms. So the way that this is going to work, if I leave the room and I type in something here and join, notice that we have the username. We have some query strings with the username and the room. So that's ultimately where this is coming from. And we want to grab these somehow. Now there's a library called QS or query string that we can use to grab these values. So let's close that up and let's search for QS cdn. So this link right here, I'm going to grab the minified version, so just copy script tag, and we want to put that in our chat HTML right above our socket.io library script. So now we have access to this query string library. And the way that we can get those values is actually pretty easy. So up here at the top, let's go right here. Let's say get username and room from URL. So we'll say const, and we can use destructuring to get the username and the room. And we can get that from the QS library from a method called parse. And we can get the URL with location.search, window.location.search. And we just want to add in an option here because we don't want to get the symbols, or I should say the characters like the ampersand and the question mark. So there's an option that we can use here called ignore query prefix, and we want to set that to true. We want to ignore that. Now, just to show you that we can get these, let's just log both of those. And now if I go back and enter the chat, you'll see it's logging Brad in JavaScript. So now we have access to these. So now let's emit an event to the server with these two things in it. So instead of console logging here, actually let's just get rid of that. We want to go under this socket and let's say join Chatroom. So we'll go ahead and emit an event called join room, and we'll go ahead and send an object with the username and the room. Now we can catch this on the server side, so let's go to our server.js, and we'll just go right to the top of where this connection is. Let's see, yeah. So basically, we have to go right here and say socket.on join room. Let's see, yeah, join room, and then that takes in an object with username and room, and this is going to be an arrow function. Now, since we're using rooms from this point on, this welcome and stuff like that, the welcome in this broadcast is actually going to go inside the join room. So we're going to go ahead and just cut that. Yeah, cut that and paste that in here. I actually want the disconnect at the end, so I'm going to put that under this chat message. Okay. Now, so we're welcoming the user to the room. We need to join the room because right now we haven't done that yet. We're just responding to this event. So we need to actually create a user. So what we'll do here is, well, actually before we do anything, let's create a new file in utils called users.js, and anything to do with users will go in here. So join when they leave, if we want to get all the users in a room, stuff like that. So we'll have our state, which will just be an array, and obviously you could connect up a database if you wanted to, but we're just basically keeping everything in memory. So join user to chat. So let's say function user join, which is basically just going to add a user to the array and return it. So in here it's going to have an ID. Every user needs a unique ID, a username, and a room. So we want to create user from the stuff that's passed in, so an object of ID, username, and room. And then we want to add to the array, so we'll take the users array and push onto it that user. Okay, and then ultimately return that user. Now at the same time, I'm going to create another function to get the current user. So let's create a function called get current user, and we'll get the user by its ID, and we're just returning the array, and we'll use the find method, which is a high order array method, takes in an arrow function. So for each user, we're going to pick out the user where the ID is equal to the ID that's passed in here. Now we need to just export these, so module.exports user join and also get current user. So now we can bring this into our server.js. So bring in from utils users, and we're bringing in a few things. So we need curly braces, we want user join, and also get current user. Now back down here where we have this this join room, let's see, yeah, so join room, so we need to actually join. So we have this room functionality with socket.io, so we can do that with socket join. Now I could hard code like JavaScript or something, but we want whatever room that the user joins, which ultimately comes from the URL. So let's set a variable of user here to user join. Okay, so this user join takes in an ID, a username, and a room. Now we already have the username in the room coming from here, so we'll paste that in. The ID, however, I'm going to use the ID of the socket, so socket.id. Okay, so that comes from here. That's going to be the user's ID, and then we want to join the user.room. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Now, this is fine, the welcome message. However, when we broadcast, it's going to be to the room. So we actually need to do broadcast.to, like this, .emit, and then put in the user.room. So this is how you can emit to a specific room. So let's save that, and let's see, I guess we could try this out. One thing we could do here is, instead of a user has joined a chat, we now have access to the username. So we can let's replace these with backticks, and let's say user.username has joined the chat. All right, so let's try that out. I'm going to go back here and say Brad join JavaScript. Okay, if I say hello, so this still says user, but we'll fix that. But what I do want to try is opening another tab and making sure that we have room functionality as far as like telling us they joined the chat. So if I do Kevin into JavaScript, we get Kevin has joined the chat. If Kevin leaves, we still have a user has, we'll fix that. But what I really want to test is if Kevin goes into PHP, to make sure that it doesn't say anything over here, which it doesn't. So that's good. All right. So now let's, what do we want to do next? Let's deal with the messaging, because right now, like I just showed you, it just says user. So back here, let's go down to where we're doing this listen for chat message. And remember, we have that get current user method we created. We're going to use that here. So we're going to set the user to get current user and pass in the socket.id to get that user. Now, just like we did above, we want to do io dot and then to, and then the room dot emit. So it'll be user dot room, or else we'll just emit to every room. And now we can replace this with user dot username in the message. So now if we go back and reload and I try to send a message here, now it gives me my name right here. All right, so messages are nicely formatted with the name, the time, and the text. And it's only being sent to this room. All right, now we want to do the same with like when the user leaves the chat, because right now it's just going to say a user has left the chat. I don't know why I keep clicking over there. So in our users.js, we're going to have a couple more functions. So let's do user leaves chat. So function, let's see, function user leave. We need the ID of the user. And basically we need to remove the user from the array. So I'm going to just, there's a lot of ways you could do this, but we're going to set an index and use users, which is the array, dot find index. And we want to say for each user, we want to find where the user.id is equal to the ID that's passed in. That'll give us the index. Then we want to check to see if the index is not equal to -1, because the way this works is if it finds it, it returns it. If not, it returns a -1. So if not indexed, then we want to return the user's array without that user, and we can do that by using splice. So we're going to splice it out by the index, and we're splicing 1. We're taking out 1 and returning it. Okay, so that's user leave, and then the last function is going to be to get room users. So let's say function get room users, and obviously we need the room, and we can, this is pretty simple, we can just use filter. So we can say for the users array we want to filter through, and we want to say for each user we want to return only if the user room is equal to the room that's passed in. All right, and then we just need to export those. So user leave, user leave and get room users, and then bring those into server.js up here. All right, cool. So let's see, in the disconnect right here, so when we disconnect, we want to run that user's leave, right? So let's set, and we need to know which user left. So let's set user to user leave and pass in the socket ID to get that user, and then check for the user, and if that user exists, then we want to do this. So we can actually just move this up into here, except we want to do io.to the user.room, and we want to emit, and then we want to say the user's actual name here. So let's turn these into backticks, and let's say user.username has left the chat. All right, now that should work. I mean, we can test that out real quick. So if I open up another tab, okay, join. So we should see over here, John has joined the chat, and if I leave, whoops, that didn't work. Leave. Okay, so it's not doing left the chat. So I must have messed something up here. So disconnect, const user, user leave, io.to, the user room, we're emitting a message, formatting it. So this didn't even, let's see, did I mess something up here? User leave. So user leave ID. Users find index. The user ID is equal to ID. The index, if it's not equal to -1, then we're going to... Oh, so instead of returning the entire array, we just want to return the user. So we need to just put in the 0 index. All right, so let's actually try that again. So, you know what, let's hold on a second. John has joined the chat. Let's leave. John has left the chat. All right, so cool. So now we want to work on this stuff over here, the sidebar. We need this info, right? So in server.js, we have our connection, we have our join room. Let's go to the bottom after the broadcast where someone has joined the chat. Let's send users and room info. So to do this, we'll do io dot to the user dot room dot emit, and we're going to emit, we'll call this room users. Okay, and then what we want to send is an object with the room, so user.room, and we also want to send all the users in the room. So remember that get user, what is it? Get room users, and then just pass in user.room. So that will send it all. We also want to send it when they disconnect, because there's going to be a list of users in the sidebar, and if someone disconnects, then we want to automatically take that user away. So down in disconnect, in this if statement right here, right after the left the chat, we want to do the same thing. Okay, so we'll save that, and now let's go to our front end JavaScript. So we want to go to main.js, and we have a few things to do here. So let's say get room and users. So socket.on, and we called that room users, and we're going to have a function with whatever the data we passed, which was room and users. So we have an arrow function. Now we need to output this stuff, so we're going to have a couple more DOM related functions. One will be output room name, where we pass in room, and then we'll have users, so output users, like that. Okay, now we need to create these two functions. So let's go down here, add room name to DOM, function output room name. So this is going to be pretty easy. If we look in chat HTML where we have the room name, right now it's hard coded right here. We can actually get rid of that JavaScript. So it has an ID of room name, and then the UL has an ID of users. We can get rid of these hard coded users. So those are the two elements that we want to bring in and then add the data to, or output the data to. So before we continue here, let's just bring those two in. So we'll say const room name equals document dot, I think it's an ID of room name, and the same thing for users, which is a UL. So this I'm going to call user list. All right, and then down here, the room name is pretty simple. It's just an H2, so we can take room name, which we just brought in, and just set the inner text, set that equal to, whoops, we just want to set it equal to the room. Right, and then let's create, let's say add users to DOM function output users, takes in the users. Now before we do the users, let's just check the room name. So we have JavaScript here. I'm just going to leave the room and join a different one. Python, and now it says Python. Now for the users, it's a little more difficult because it's an array, and there's a lot of different ways we could do this. We could, set an output variable, do a for each and all that. But an easy way to do this is to take the user list, which is the UL that we brought in, set the inner HTML equal to some backticks, and inside here we can take, since this is a template string, we're going to need to use this syntax and say users.map. Okay, so we're mapping through the array and say for each user we want to output a string with li, and then in here we want the user.username. Now in order for this to work, we actually have to tack on the join method because it's an array, and save, and that should actually do it. So if I reload, there we go, we have Brad. So let's just try this. Say Jack join JavaScript, and wait a minute. You know what, let me just leave, let's start over here. So just double check this. User list. Oh, so for the join, we need to put in just double quotes here. So join, we're just turning an array into a string and outputting it. Yeah, so let's try this again. So Brad joins JavaScript is put over here, and then Jack joins JavaScript, and Brad's already in here. Good. Over here we get Jack has joined the chat, and he gets put here. Cool. So if I put something in here, hello, Jack should see it over here. Good. So if I leave the room and let's say Jack joins Python or PHP, now Brad isn't in here anymore because we're not in the same room, and that doesn't show up over here. Perfect. So this is working really good. So I think that should do it. Now, of course, you could add on to this. In fact, I would encourage that if you want to integrate MongoDB or some kind of SQL database or whatever, and store the users and basically have them log in to join the chat. You could do that. I might actually do something with this. Add a database, maybe integrate Electron and make it into a desktop app. So yeah, so expect to see something added onto this application. But that's it, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope everybody is keeping safe and not going nuts. I know this is a crazy time. I just wanted to create some kind of project to at least take your mind off things for a little while and just focus on something else. But that's it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.